The year is 927. There is no England. There is only mud, fields carved by iron plows, villages huddled behind wooden palisades, rivers that serve as the only roads worth trusting. To the north, the Scots hold their hills. To the west, the Welsh cling to kingdoms older than memory. In the east, and across a great swath of the Midlands, Viking settlers have lived for 2 generations, speaking their own tongue, worshipping their own gods, burying their dead in their own way. And everywhere in between, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Northumbria. Not one country, not one people. A patchwork of loyalties stitched together by violence and undone just as quickly. This is the world that most people alive in 927 were born into, and most of them expected to die in it. The man at its center, a ceorl, what historians would later call a free peasant, woke before dawn. Not because he chose to, because his animals demanded it, his lord demanded it, and the land demanded it above all. He wore wool, heavy, rough, undyed wool that scratched against skin already toughened by years of outdoor labor. His shoes, if he had them, were simple leather turned inside out and tied around his feet with strips of hide. Breakfast, if there was breakfast, was bread, dark, dense, made from barley or rye. Because wheat was expensive, wheat was for those above him. He ate standing. There was no time to sit. His world was small. Most ceorls in 10th century Anglo-Saxon Britain never traveled more than 20 miles from their village their entire lives. They paid taxes, called gafol, to a thegn, a local lord who paid upward to an ealdorman, who answered to a king. The king answered to God, and God, according to every bishop in every church in every kingdom, was watching. But so were the Vikings, not the storybook Vikings with horned helmets. That image is a myth. The real ones wore iron helmets with nose guards, carried round shields, and moved fast, brutally fast. They had been raiding, then settling, then governing parts of Britain for over 100 years by 927. The Danelaw, the territory where Danish law and custom held sway, stretched across a massive portion of eastern and northern England. York, one of the most important cities on the island, had been a Viking capital for decades. For the Anglo-Saxon peasant, this was not history. This was Tuesday. The threat of raid, of burning, of being taken as a slave. These were not abstract fears. They were the reason villages built wooden walls, the reason men kept spears within reach of their beds, the reason the Anglo-Saxon word for peace, frith, carried inside it a kind of desperate hope that the word itself could conjure the thing it described. This was the world in 927, fragmented, exhausted, and completely unaware that something was about to happen that had never happened before. Stay with us until the very end of this story, because what comes next changed the course of history, and the people living through it had no idea. His name was Æthelstan, and he was not supposed to be king. He was the eldest son of Edward the Elder, himself the son of Alfred the Great, the king who had stopped the Viking tide at the Battle of Edington in 878, and kept Wessex alive by sheer grinding will. Alfred's legacy was immense. His son Edward had built on it, pushing back the Danelaw, reclaiming land, tightening the grip of Wessex over southern Britain. But dynasties are complicated things. Edward had multiple wives, multiple sons, and when he died in 924, the question of succession became a knot that nearly came undone. Æthelstan had been raised at the court of his aunt Æthelflæd in Mercia, the Lady of the Mercians, one of the most extraordinary rulers of her age. He had been educated by the church, trained in warfare, and shaped by a world that was constantly on the edge of collapse. He understood politics the way soldiers understand weather, not as something to predict, but as something to survive. When Edward died, Æthelstan became king of Mercia. His younger half-brother, Ælfweard, took Wessex. For 16 days, Britain had 2 Anglo-Saxon kings. Then Ælfweard died, suddenly, under circumstances that were never fully explained. 16 days. And then Æthelstan stood alone. He was not universally welcomed. There were rivals, whispers, men who questioned the legitimacy of his claim. A kingdom held together by fear of Vikings was not a kingdom that automatically accepted the man who showed up and said he was in charge. Æthelstan understood this. He did something his predecessors had rarely done. He moved. In 927, he turned north. York was the prize. The Viking city, known in Old Norse as Jórvík, was the heart of the Danelaw in northern England. A trading hub, a fortress, a statement of Viking permanence on British soil. Its ruler had been Ceorls, a Norse king who had 2 years earlier made peace with Æthelstan and even married his sister. It was a political marriage, a fragile one. Ceorls died in early 927, and Æthelstan marched. He gave no warning that would matter. He moved with the speed that his grandfather Alfred had perfected, using the network of fortified towns called burhs that Alfred had built across Wessex and that Edward had expanded northward. These were not just military installations. They were infrastructure, roads, markets, mints, administrative centers. The burhs were the skeleton of a kingdom that didn't yet have a name. Æthelstan took York without a major pitched battle. The city's new rulers, Ceorls' relatives, scrambling to hold power, could not organize resistance fast enough. York fell. The Viking kingdom of Northumbria collapsed. But taking York was only the beginning. Because now every other king on the island had a decision to make. What happened next would define the next 1,000 years of British history. July 12th, 927. A place called Eamont Bridge, near Penrith, in what is now Cumbria. 4 kings stood together. Æthelstan of the Anglo-Saxons, Constantine II of Scotland, Owain of Strathclyde, Hywel Dee of the Welsh kingdom of Deheubarth, representing the Welsh kings broadly. These were not men who liked each other. They were not men who trusted each other. They were men who had looked at what had just happened in York and understood, with the cold clarity that political survival produces, what their options were. They acknowledged Æthelstan's supremacy. The Latin records from the time are careful with language. The kings renounced all idolatry, a reference to Viking paganism that was more political than religious, and pledged to keep the peace. They swore oaths. They accepted, in the measured words of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that Æthelstan was their overlord. This was not a coronation. It was not a treaty, signing with quill and parchment and solemn ceremony. It was 4 powerful men standing in a field by a bridge, doing the math and choosing survival over pride. For the scribes and bishops who witnessed it, it was something more. They began, for the first time, to use a new phrase with consistency. Rex totius Britanniae, King of all Britain, or in the vernacular slowly emerging from the mouths of ordinary people, King of Engleland, England. The word existed now. But what did it mean to the people living inside it? The Thane, the local lord, who received the news in his hall, probably heard it from a traveling priest or a merchant passing through. He would have nodded, filed it away, gone back to the business of managing his land, his men, his obligations. Kings made proclamations. The harvest still needed to come in. The monk in his scriptorium, copying documents by candlelight with fingers stained by oak gall ink, understood the significance more acutely. He was part of the church's vast administrative network, the institution that, more than any army, would hold this New England together. The church kept records, kept calendars. kept the idea of a unified Christian kingdom alive, even when the politics fractured. And the Viking settler in the former Danelaw, the man whose grandfather had come from Norway or Denmark, who now spoke a mix of Old Norse and Old English that was already creating new words, new sounds, new ways of saying ordinary things. He watched and waited. His land had changed hands. His customs had not yet. The England born at Eamont Bridge in 927 was real. But it was fragile, and the people living inside it were about to discover exactly how fragile. Unification changed everything, and it changed almost nothing. The ceorls still woke before dawn, still paid his gaffel, still wore rough wool and ate dark bread, and kept his spear by the door. The king had a new title. The peasant had the same mud. But some things did shift, slowly, unevenly, in ways that would only become visible across generations. The burh system that Æthelstan inherited and expanded was perhaps the most consequential change in ordinary English life. These fortified towns, there were roughly 30 of them by the 930s, were not just military outposts. They were economic engines. By royal decree, certain transactions could only take place inside a burh, in front of witnesses. This meant trade had to come to town, and where trade came, craftsmen followed. Smiths, potters, leather workers, cloth merchants, the beginning of something that would eventually be called an urban economy. Winchester, Oxford, Exeter. These were not just names on a map. They were places where people gathered, argued, bought, sold, prayed, and slowly began to think of themselves as part of something larger than their village. The church anchored all of it. Every burh had a church. Many had minsters, larger ecclesiastical centers staffed by communities of priests. The church baptized you, married you, buried you, and told you in the same breath what your obligations were to God and King. Archbishop Wulfhelm of Canterbury was one of Æthelstan's closest advisors. The alliance between the throne and the altar was not incidental. It was structural. The kingdom ran on it. But here is what the textbooks rarely say. In the former Danelaw, across Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, the East Midlands, there were entire communities still living under Danish customs, Danish laws, Danish social structures. The wapentake, the Viking administrative unit equivalent to an Anglo-Saxon hundred, continued to function. Place names ending in by and thorp, Viking suffixes meaning farmstead and village, were everywhere. They still are. Grimsby, Whitby, Scunthorpe. These names are the fossils of a culture that did not simply disappear because a new king held a meeting by a bridge. The English language itself was being forged in this collision. Old English and Old Norse were close enough that speakers could communicate, borrow from each other, shed grammatical complexity that had grown unwieldy. The result, over centuries, would become the most widely spoken language on Earth. But in 927, it was just two groups of people haggling at a market, each reaching for words the other might understand. Violence had not ended. Æthelstan fought constantly against Welsh kings who pushed back against tribute demands, against Scottish nobles who tested borders, against Viking leaders who had not given up on northern England. The Peace of Eamont Bridge was a political fact, not a lived reality. Life in the New England was not peaceful. It was organized, and in the 10th century, that was close enough. Æthelstan died on October 27, 939. He was approximately 44 years old. He left no children, no direct heir. The kingdom he had built passed to his half-brothers, Edmund, then Edred, and the decades that followed were not stable. The Vikings returned. York was lost and then recaptured. The borders of England flexed and bent under pressure that never fully stopped. And yet, something had changed that could not be unchanged. The idea of England, Englaland, the land of the Angles, had taken root in ways that went deeper than royal decrees. The church had recorded it. The coins bore it. Æthelstan's charters used the language of a unified nation with a consistency that his predecessors never had. He signed himself Rex Anglorum, King of the English, not King of Wessex, not King of the Mercians, King of the English. In 937, 10 years after Eamont Bridge, Æthelstan fought the largest battle of his reign, and possibly the largest battle fought on British soil to that point. At a place called Brunanburh, whose exact location historians still debate, a coalition of Vikings, Scots, and Strathclyde Britons came together in one final attempt to break the New England apart. Constantine II of Scotland, the same king who had bowed at Eamont Bridge a decade earlier, led his army south. What followed was catastrophic. For the attackers, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the battle in verse, the only time it did so for any single event in the entire chronicle. 5 kings fell on the field. 7 of the Viking leader Anlaf's earls died before nightfall. Constantine's own son was killed. The Norse survivors retreated to their ships and sailed into darkness. The poem written to commemorate it is one of the oldest surviving pieces of English literature. It ends not with triumph, but with weight. Never yet in this island was there greater slaughter of an army with the sword's edge. The ceorl who had survived all of this, the wars, the taxes, the raids, the reorganizations of power that swept over him like weather, probably did not know he was living inside a turning point of history. He knew his field, his animals, the name of the priest who baptized his children, the face of the Lord who took a portion of everything he grew. He did not know the word England would still exist 1,000 years later. He did not know his language would cross oceans. He did not know that the rough, difficult, exhausted life he lived in 927 was the foundation of something so large it would one day be almost impossible to measure. He just knew the sun was coming up. The animals needed feeding, and the land, as always, was waiting. England was not declared into existence. It was not born in a palace or written into being by a single document. It was built slowly, violently, imperfectly, by the accumulated weight of ordinary people living through extraordinary times without fully understanding what they were living through. That is how nations are made, not by kings alone, by everyone who keeps going when everything says stop. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below and tell us what surprised you most about life in 927. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Because history is full of stories like this one, and we're just getting started.